I was 70 when I first realized the house had grown quiet, but not in the peaceful way you'd hope. It was the kind of silence that made you feel invisible, not because no one was home, but because you were no longer heard. My daughter was in the kitchen, her hands moving fast over her phone, while I was trying to tell her about a dream I had. A strange one. Something about walking barefoot through the snow. I remember I laughed softly, telling her how vivid it felt. The crunch of it, the cold between my toes. But she didn't look up, just nodded absently, like I was part of the furniture humming in the background. And I knew, in that small, painful moment, I had lost something. Not my voice, I could still speak, but something deeper, my place. There's a strange shift that happens after 65. You don't feel it all at once. At first, you're still called Dad with warmth. Still needed, consulted. Then slowly, almost tenderly, those needs fade. They have jobs now, children, their own lives running on rails you no longer built. And before you know it, you've become a footnote in the conversations. The room continues, but your presence doesn't seem to shape it anymore. I spent years thinking maybe I was being sensitive. Maybe I was expecting too much. But I've lived long enough to know the difference between loneliness and being unseen. What no one tells you about growing older is that the erosion isn't always physical. Yes, the knees stiffen, the back complains, but that's expected. What you're never quite prepared for is the erosion of relevance, of being looked through, like your words are clouds, soft and harmless, floating above the real weather of their day. I wasn't always this way. There was a time I commanded rooms without saying a word. My kids used to fight over who got to sit on my shoulders. My voice was enough to calm a tantrum or spark a dream. I was their compass, their roof, their rhythm. And then, something shifted. I don't blame them. Life speeds up in your 30s, 40s. You're scrambling to make ends meet, to prove yourself, to raise the next generation. I did the same. I remember barely calling my own mother some months. I thought she'd always be there. I thought later was infinite. So no, I don't blame them. But I do remember how it felt. Sitting at the table, listening to them talk over me. Offering a suggestion and being met with, "Yeah, we'll figure it out." Not cruel, just dismissive in that casual, unthinking way. The way you might swat away a bit of lint on your sweater. And that's the thing, isn't it? Disrespect doesn't always roar. Sometimes it sighs. There was one day, not even a dramatic one, that stays with me. My grandson had a school play. I cleared my whole week just to be there. Woke up early, pressed my shirt, even rehearsed a little joke I thought he'd laugh at. And when I arrived, my son barely made eye contact. "You made it," he said, as if it surprised him. I smiled, nodded, and sat quietly in the back row. That night, I didn't sleep much. I wasn't angry, just heavy, like I had become something optional. And that's when it hit me, not as a theory but as a knowing. I had let myself become optional. Not because I wasn't worthy of respect, but because I had forgotten how to ask for it without begging. I had been so afraid to lose their closeness, I'd accepted being ignored just to remain included. I'd answer every call even when I was tired. I'd watch the kids last minute, even when my knees were screaming. I'd say, "It's fine, don't worry," every time they forgot my birthday or canceled lunch. And in doing so, I taught them to see me as someone who would always say yes. I don't say this to shame them. I say it because we who have lived long, who have buried friends, who have survived things they'll never know, we must remember our own weight. Respect doesn't grow from guilt. It grows from presence. There's a quiet dignity in choosing not to over-explain yourself. In letting your no stand without a footnote. In walking out of a room where your voice is not heard. Not in anger, but in honor. You see, the day I began to reclaim my voice wasn't loud. I didn't raise it. I didn't make demands. I simply stopped bending. When they called last minute, I said, "I already have plans." And I did plans to sit on the porch with a cup of tea and listen to the birds. That counts. When they interrupted me, I paused. Not in submission, but in calm. I'd say, "I'll continue when I feel you're really listening." And I meant it. I stopped filling every silence with helpfulness. I stopped answering texts at midnight. I stopped explaining myself when I was tired. It was hard at first. The habit of being needed is a strong one. But slowly, something beautiful returned. My presence stopped being taken for granted and started being noticed. They began to call just to talk, not for help, just for company. And the most healing moment? My daughter, after one dinner, looked at me and said, "I missed hearing your stories." That one sentence was worth the wait. It takes a kind of quiet strength to stop giving what no one thanks you for. I learned that lesson slowly, like water dripping on stone. Not because I was unkind, but because I didn't know how to receive without overextending. For years, I thought my love had to be proven through doing. Fixing the sink, watching the grandkids, writing checks when the car broke down. But there's a truth you come to understand in the later chapters of life. Love that isn't returned with regard begins to hollow you out. I remember a day, it was cold early winter, when I got a call from my son. His tone was rushed. He needed help with something, I don't even remember what now. And I said yes before even thinking. I always did. Hung up the phone, grabbed my coat, and then I sat down on the edge of the bed. I felt this sudden ache in my chest. Not from illness, but from the weight of my own compliance. I wasn't needed. I was used. And the worst part? I had volunteered for it. It's easy, to think that if you give enough, love will flow back like a tide. But tides don't return to deserts. And sometimes people, even our children, stop noticing the hands that are always open. That day, I didn't go. I called back gently and said I wouldn't be coming, that I was feeling tired, and I needed to rest. He hesitated, then said, "Okay, hope you feel better." He didn't sound angry, just surprised. And that told me everything. My no had become unfamiliar. But here's the thing, that unfamiliarity, it didn't break us, cleared the fog. Over time, my no became a line of definition, not division. I wasn't withdrawing my love. I was teaching them how to see it. That's something I wish more of us understood. Saying no, setting boundaries, these aren't acts of distance. They're acts of self-respect. And in respecting ourselves, we give others a chance to rediscover us. Not as resources, not as background noise, but as people, whole people. I think of my friend Walt, who's about my age. Strong voice, still. Laughed loud, played the harmonica at church. But at home, his son rarely listened. Walt used to yell, try to push his way back into relevance. One day, he told me, "I raised that boy with discipline, but now I feel like a ghost in my own kitchen." I told him something I had only recently started to believe. Stop shouting to be heard. Start whispering to be respected. And that's what he did. He stopped arguing, started doing things alone, went fishing even when no one joined, read poetry out loud just for himself. And after a while, that quiet strength began to draw his son in. Not because of guilt, but because curiosity returned. Who is this man? His son began to wonder. Who doesn't need to be needed? And in that wondering came respect. We mustn't forget. We are still shaping the atmosphere of our families. Even now, even in silence. That's something sacred, the way presence carries power. I also learned something else, perhaps harder to say aloud. Something that took more courage than I expected. I had to stop waiting by the phone. You see, I used to leave the ringer on loud, even through the night, just in case. I told myself it was practical, but it wasn't. It was hope, misplaced and aching. I checked the call log, even when I knew nothing had come in. The silence wasn't just in the air. It was in me. But one morning, I decided to let the phone ring if it wanted. I got up, made coffee, walked outside barefoot, the way I used to when I was young and broke and happy. And in the sun, just for a moment, I remembered I was still me. Not just their father. Not just their fallback. Me. I joined a walking group that month. Bunch of old geezers like me, knees creaking in unison. But we laughed more in those walks than I had in years. And I noticed something odd. The less I waited by the phone, the more it started ringing. Real calls. "Hey Dad, how've you been?" No requests. Just conversation. It wasn't magic. It was space. When we stop chasing closeness, we make room for genuine connection to return. If you're still here, leave me a comment. Just a line or two to let me know I'm not talking to the wind. Tell me something small. When was the last time you said no and felt good about it? I'll keep reading even if I don't reply to every word. Your voices matter too. There's a different kind of silence that comes when you're no longer trying to be the center of anyone's life. Not the heavy kind I spoke of earlier, the kind that makes you feel invisible. No, this silence, it's earned. It's peaceful. It feels like sitting beside a stream after years of running uphill. I found it only after letting go of a weight I didn't even know I was carrying. The need to be someone's emotional center crept in quietly, that need. After my wife passed, the house felt hollow. The days stretched. The dinners were quieter. I thought, or maybe hoped, that my children would fill that space, that they'd drop by more often, that their voices would bring back the rhythm of old times. But what I hadn't realized was that I was asking them to fill something that wasn't theirs to fill. And when they didn't, I felt hurt, rejected, unimportant, to call more than I should, leave voicemails that didn't need answers, try to stay on the phone a little longer, ask about things I wasn't really curious about just to keep the line alive. I told myself I was being a good father, but beneath that, I was lonely, and I wanted them to fix it, but they couldn't. And when I started to sense their weariness, the short replies, the postponed visits, the polite tone that sounds like obligation, that's when I knew I was holding them too tightly. So I stopped, not out of spite, not to punish, but because I had to free both them and myself from a role they didn't sign up for. I began to build a life again. Small things at first. I started waking early, not to wait for calls, but to walk, just around the block, slowly, with no destination but movement itself. I picked up painting again, poorly but joyfully. I wrote letters to old friends I'd lost touch with. Some wrote back, some didn't. It didn't matter. The reaching out itself made me feel alive. Then one day my granddaughter called, just to say she'd read a book I once told her about. "You still read, Grandpa?" she asked. I smiled. "Yes," I said. "Still." She paused a beat, then said, "That's cool." Cool. I hadn't been called that in a long time. And that's the thing, when you build a life outside of being needed, people start seeing you differently. Not as someone waiting, but as someone living. The truth is, I'm not the same man I was at 40 or even 60. Back then, I was a pillar, provider, someone whose usefulness was tied to what I could give, fix, or arrange. But now I'm something else entirely. I'm still a father, still a grandfather, but I'm also a man who sits with silence without fearing it. A man who prays in the morning not for answers, but for peace. A man who listens more than he speaks, not because he's timid, but because he no longer needs to win. That shift, from being emotionally dependent to emotionally grounded, changed everything. When my children visit now, I don't hover. I don't fill every silence. I don't steer the conversation toward my needs. And strangely enough, they stay longer. They linger. They ask more questions. I've become a presence, not a pressure. And let me tell you, that change didn't come through effort. Came through release. There's a deep wisdom in realizing that our worth is not in how often we are called, or how frequently we are asked to help. It's in how solid we remain, even when we are not needed. We become like trees, no longer chasing the wind, but standing still and steady. And in that stillness, people gather, not because we beckon, but because we are rooted. I remember once, during a family dinner, my daughter said something dismissive. Not cruel, just thoughtless. Years ago, I would have let it slide, or maybe laughed it off. But that evening, I looked at her gently and said, "I know you didn't mean it unkindly, but it landed a little sharp." She blinked, then nodded.
I'm sorry, Dad. No defensiveness. No debate.
I think she saw me in that moment, not as a fragile man needing affirmation, but as a whole person worthy of care. That's all we want, isn't it? Not to be honored like statues, but to be regarded like human beings. And I suppose that's what I've learned most of all in these years of softening. When you stop demanding respect and start living with quiet dignity, respect finds its way back. It returns like a bird you stopped chasing. It lands on your windowsill when the house is calm again. I've come to believe there's a sacred difference between love and respect. Love in families often sticks around even when everything else falls apart. It's stubborn that way. It hides in gestures, in history, in blood. But respect, now that's more delicate, more easily misplaced, and far more difficult to regain once lost. I remember a time when I let too many things slide in the name of keeping the peace. My children would cut me off mid-sentence, change the topic, forget I was even talking. And I'd laugh it off, tell myself they're busy. They don't mean it. Don't make it awkward, old man. But the truth is, peace that costs you your voice isn't peace. It's a quiet tyranny. I had to learn to draw lines, not with anger, not with ultimatums, just a firm, steady line between what I would and would not accept anymore. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't storm out of rooms or hang up the phone. I simply began to name things, softly, honestly. When someone interrupted me, I'd say, "I'll wait until you're ready to hear me." When a decision was made about me without with me, I'd say, "I'd like to be included next time." And when my thoughts were brushed aside with that condescending tone children sometimes use on their elders, I'd say, "You don't have to agree with me, but I do expect to be treated with respect." Simple words, but spoken with calm, they land differently. The first few times, they didn't quite know how to react. My son frowned once, said I was being too sensitive, but I didn't argue. I just smiled a little and said, "Or maybe you've just gotten used to me being silent." He didn't respond, but the next time he listened. That's the thing about boundaries, real ones. They don't create walls. They create clarity. They tell people, here I am. I exist. And I have worth whether you acknowledge it or not. My friend Lillian, she's 83 now, sharper than I've ever been, once told me, "The older I get, the less I explain myself." And I've come to love that idea. We've spent decades justifying our choices, proving our value, accommodating others. At some point, you've earned the right to take up space without apology. So that's what I started doing. I stopped answering calls during my reading time. I stopped saying yes when I meant no. I stopped laughing at jokes I didn't find funny, just to make them feel comfortable. And here's the twist, the more I honored my time, the more they did too. My son, who used to show up unannounced, started calling ahead. My daughter, who used to ask me to babysit at the last minute, began checking in with, "Is this a good time for you?" They didn't say it aloud, but I could feel it. Something in the way they regarded me had shifted. I was no longer just dad or grandpa. A fixture in the background, always available, always agreeable. I had become a person again, a man with edges, a man with a life. And that life, well, it's quieter than it used to be, but it's mine. Some mornings I sit at the park with a thermos of tea, watching the ducks. I nod at the same old man walking his dog. I read novels I once put off. I write letters I may never send. I move slowly, but I move with intention. This life is not flashy, but it is filled with a kind of peace that can't be borrowed or bought. It's the peace of knowing I've stopped begging for space and started claiming it gently as mine. And there's one more thing I had to let go of, the urge to give endlessly. That may sound harsh coming from a father, but hear me out. I used to think that giving my time, my money, my energy was the only way to stay relevant. So I gave, even when I was tired, even when I wasn't appreciated, especially when I wasn't appreciated. But giving without gratitude isn't generosity. It's self-erasure. I remember loaning money I couldn't spare, watching the grandkids when I was too exhausted to move, sitting through visits where I was more chauffeur than guest. And every time I told myself, this is what love does. But love also rests. Love also says, not today, I'm tired. Love also trusts that it doesn't need to buy its place at the table. So I pulled back, not in bitterness, but in wisdom. I stopped offering help before it was asked. I started saying, I'd love to, but I can't this time. I started believing that my worth wasn't tied to my usefulness. At first, they didn't understand. My son was annoyed when I didn't bail him out of a last-minute trip. My daughter sighed when I turned down babysitting. But eventually, they adjusted, and slowly, they began to say thank you again, because suddenly what I gave was no longer expected. It was a gift. There is dignity in limits. There is grace in saying no. And there is power, real, lasting power, in showing up as someone whose presence is not owed, but offered. You don't realize how much of yourself you've given away until one day you start gathering the pieces back. Not with anger, but with care. It happens slowly. A morning when you wake up and decide not to apologize for being tired. An afternoon when you decline an invitation, not because you're bitter, but because you'd rather sit in the sun alone. An evening when your phone rings and you let it go to voicemail just this once. Little by little, you reclaim your rhythm, and with it, your voice. These days, I don't speak more than I used to, but I speak differently. There's weight in my words again. Not because I've become louder, but because I no longer fill the silence with need. You see, when I was younger, I thought being loved meant being indispensable. I thought if I wasn't the one holding the family together, I might disappear. But I was wrong. Love isn't proven through exhaustion. Respect isn't won by bending. It's funny. Now that I've stepped back, I'm seeing more clearly. My son asks me things again, not just errands, but advice. He sits a little longer when he visits. Sometimes he'll even bring over a bottle of wine and say, "Let's just talk for a bit, Dad." Talk, not fix, not solve, just be. And my daughter, she hugs me tighter now, as if something between us has softened. I think she sees me now not just as her father, but as a man who lived, who lost, who learned. I don't need to be the center of their lives anymore. And that's what made room for me to become part of their hearts again. Because when we stop living through our children, we finally learn how to live alongside them. It's one of the great unspoken graces of growing older, the chance to live with less noise and more meaning, to speak only when moved, to help only when asked, and to love without tying your identity to whether it is returned the way you hoped. There are days when I still feel the ache of being forgotten. That doesn't go away entirely. I'm human. Sometimes I wish they called more. Sometimes I wish they asked more about my stories. But I don't sit in that ache anymore. Instead, I tend to it gently, like a small plant in the corner. I water it, I prune it, but I don't let it take over the whole room. And I've grown to cherish the things they do give now. A photo of the grandkids on the fridge. A message just saying, "Thinking of you." A cup of coffee shared in silence. Those are the new currencies of respect. Quiet but valuable. I once told a neighbor, a man not much younger than me, "You can't make your children respect you by reminding them of the diapers you changed." He laughed, then grew quiet. Then how do you get it back? I thought about that for a long moment and said, "You stop chasing it. You build a life so steady, so rooted, that they start looking at you again. Not because you raised them, but because you've raised yourself." And that, I suppose, is the final truth I've come to learn. We don't just grow old. We grow inward. We stop being needed in the ways we once were, and start being respected for who we've become. Not everyone will see it. Not all children will change. And not all wounds will close neatly. But that doesn't mean your voice is gone. It only means it's no longer shouting over the noise of trying to be loved. It's whispering now, but with the power of a whole life behind it. And sometimes, a whisper is all it takes to be heard. So if you're listening to this now, perhaps alone in your room, or during a quiet walk, or while sipping your evening tea, I hope you know this. You are not invisible. You are not forgotten. You are not just someone's past. You are still becoming, still worthy, still whole. And if you'd like to return, you know where to find me. This space doesn't go anywhere. It will still be here, waiting quietly, patiently, just like we've learned to do.